We are in this zone between 90,000 to 106,000. So that's a 16,000 level. And then if you add another 16,000, that gets you to 122,000. That's sort of like our target. I hope we're going to get there by end of February. We might get there by March, but I'm quite bullish right now.
We all want to believe in something. In Chinese, belief also means trust. We want to trust our systems and each other so we can build a future beyond what we know. Join us at Consensus Hong Kong, where belief becomes real.
Hello and welcome to Markets Daily, hosted by me, Jen Sanasi. On this show, we navigate the currents shaping the crypto markets, providing insights against the broader financial landscape. So whether you're actively trading or just fascinated by the volatility that is the crypto markets, this show is your compass to understanding what's happened, where we are, and where we're going. Joining today's show is 10X Research founder, Markus Thielen. Markus, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Of course, a lot to talk about in the markets. I feel like a lot has happened since you and I last chatted, but let's talk about what's going on this morning. Markets recovering a little bit from yesterday's tech crash. Of course, that was spurred by China's DeepSeek AI model. Talk to me a little bit about what you're watching this morning, given yesterday's events.
Well, of course, everybody has become an expert around, AI, what's happening, what does it mean? I think a lot of people were actually aware already last week. And maybe I think the intention from some of the stock investors was to lighten up a little bit on the tech shares, by themselves, really, when the earnings come out, basically on Wednesday and on Thursday. I think that was kind of what people sort of like expected, because last earnings season, it was already relatively tough, right? People were anticipating that corporate executives kind of guiding a little bit how much money actually is being spent and how much money probably going to turn into revenues. But, there was no guidance last quarter. So I think this quarter, investors probably became a little bit tired and wanted to lighten up. And I think we lightened up a little bit earlier than expected. And I think that's what everybody is looking at. But I do think that sets up the FOMC meeting for this week a little bit more on the dovish side, was actually quite positive for the market.
It's interesting you say that, because I think about yesterday, I think about looking at some of the news headlines yesterday, and there were words like Black Swan event and market crash and what's going to happen next. And what you're saying is the writing's been on the wall for a little bit now. And if you've really been watching the markets, you may have expected this, and it's not an event that's really going to shake anything in the long term.
Well, precisely. I think when you look back, since basically June, NVIDIA has been flat. So this whole, super cycle has actually been a little bit slower than probably people expected, and it's been really disappointed for those people that are really into these high beta tech stocks. And normally what we have seen, of course, with Trump's first election and now with his, second election, that actually the domestic companies actually are performing, much better. So since June, since NVIDIA is basically flat, we have the XLF as a bank index is actually up 26%. So we're seeing already the shift towards the domestic economy. And I think that's kind of like a clear sign. And I think that's how, when we look from a relative perspective, how, certain cryptocurrencies have outperformed. But again, from the stock market, it's, I think, a clear indication where the trend is going. And the trend is really going to the domestic focused stocks. Investors were already expecting that the tech market is really slowing down a little bit. We're seeing this already. How some leading tech analysts have sort of lowered their numbers a little bit. And I think when we're coming into this week, we are expecting some volatility. Of course, we didn't expect a little mini crash that we have seen. But nevertheless, I think I'm not too concerned about it, because it means actually some more positive for the domestic economy. And that's where we can see how the circle closes for investors.
You mentioned a few points I want to dig a little bit deeper on. But first, you mentioned that FOMC meeting. What are you expecting to hear there?
So, of course, when we look back in the December FOMC meeting, the Fed and Powell especially were quite hawkish, and I think it surprised the market. But I do think they have dialed it down or dialed it back a little bit after the January CPI data. We have, Fed Governor Christopher Waller coming in, indicating actually that the CPI was not as high or is not as hawkish as, as the headline number indicated at 2.9%. And I think also the expectations actually ramped up into that number. So the expectation was suddenly reset. And since then, we actually had a rebound. And I think we are on a track that towards end of this month, when the when the next FOMC meeting is, towards later this week, that the FOMC meeting will probably be still indicating that Fed cuts are coming. I think the market prices in 2 cuts. So the question is only just when. And so I'm not too concerned about it. And I do think the market is going to take some breathing room and start to rally, especially, for example, like Bitcoin. When you look at last night, Bitcoin, yes, it fell, but it recovered quite a bit. So we're not really down much. I think we are just still holding into this level. And I think we are slowly going also into February. And February tends to be usually a very strong month for Bitcoin.
I know the last time you and I spoke, you predicted a rally, new all-time highs before March. I believe that we achieved that in December. Talk to me a little bit more about what you expect in February, and could we see another all-time high before March?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, all-time high is just, a couple of percent away, basically. But normally, February is sort of like the second or the third strongest month in the year. So that's usually a good time to be long. We had a breakout signal, last week also, in Bitcoin that has usually been a good leading signal really for the market to ramp higher. The Chinese New Year, which starts officially tomorrow, that's usually a good environment to be long Bitcoin. I think there are like a bunch of signals there that we monitor. We do think actually the market is a little bit stronger than some people expect. I mean, we're seeing, for example, that stablecoin inflows are picking up, not necessarily through Tether, but more through Circle. I think that's kind of interesting that money is actually coming into the market. Yes, the funding rates are pretty, tight right now, so they're pretty low, so it doesn't really indicate a lot of speculation. But I think flows have been, picking up, and I think again I go back to the January January CPI data point. Since then, actually, the ETF inflows have started to pick up again. And since the December FOMC meeting until the January CPI data, the inflows were actually non-existent, but they have just picked up. So I think that's really like a good sign. That's why we are actually more bullish right now. We're not saying everything is green. We're not saying is a parabolic move is coming, but we do think we can move something like 16,000 points because the Bitcoin price, since really the ETFs came out a year ago, has been moving in these 16,000 points, move up, go sideways, move up 16,000 points, go sideways, and so on. And we have seen this step up process for the last couple of months, really, or if not quarters.
Do you have a price target for February?
Well, I hope we're going to get to like around 122,000. I mean, that's kind of like the level because we are in this zone between 90,000 to 106,000. So that's a 16,000 level. And then if you add another 16,000, that gets you to 122,000. That's sort of like our target. I hope we're going to get there by end of February. We might get there by March, but I'm quite bullish right now.
When we kicked off the interview, you were talking about this shift towards financial over tech stocks. You mentioned NVIDIA trading sideways since June and the XLF ETF, which is up about 26%. Talk to me a little bit more about the significance here. What does this tell you about the shift in market and where investors should be paying attention to over the coming months?
Yeah, so I do think that, when we look also since the Trump election, which coins really have outperformed, and it's very much the coins that are focusing more on the US economy, you can argue, on the payment processing coins that are, maybe used for, I mean, Ripple, of course, is named quite often, but others, as well. So we think that's kind of like the way to focus on. Of course, meme coins is always like kind of speculative, but we have seen they come and go. And it's very tricky to stay into it. But I think that the narrative of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which has been actually almost around, it was first mentioned like 10 years ago, but of course it was mentioned more through Senator Loomis in end of July, really. But this is not just a strategic Bitcoin reserve, rather a strategic digital asset reserve. So there is already talk that maybe some other coins might be part of it. And I think that kind of like makes it quite interesting. So it's not just one winner take all, which of course we would prefer actually Bitcoin, because I think we can, build a strong narrative around it. But of course we have seen, other coins really coming into the forefront, Solana and, Ripple and everything. So in the end, I think the money is shifting to those coins. The money is coming in, which we're seeing through the stable coin inflows. So that makes us, quite bullish right now.
One of the other points in the report that I want to touch on are the potential of crypto companies IPOing this year. I know that you have some thoughts on what this could mean for Bitcoin and crypto at large, but just talk to me a little bit. I know that there are a handful of companies that are looking to IPO this year, and under the new administration, it might become a little bit easier for them. Talk to me about how you make sense of that against Bitcoin and the larger crypto market.
Yeah, very often we're seeing, of course, these IPOs happening when the Bitcoin market is doing quite well. They tend to really be timed really well. So, of course, our expectations is we are in a 2-year bull market now already. That is really time for some crypto companies really to launch. And we saw during the SPAC episode that some of these IPOs failed. They're going to be repriced, but I think the window is actually there now, and so there is an incentive to keep the Bitcoin price high and actually to move it up, because that usually brings in a lot of attention. We have seen this, of course, with the Coinbase IPO, or the Coinbase listing in April 2021, which was, of course, perfectly timed with the first peak of that year. And then, of course, we had like a later peak, but it was really mainly the Coinbase listing. And very similarly, when we had the CME Bitcoin futures in December 2017, the market, Bitcoin also rallied massively into that event. So we think there's going to be probably some IPO machine in the background being run right now. We know some candidates, and the list that we came up with was kind of like the 10 largest names that appear to either were close to an IPO, during the previous cycle, or the SPAC IPO failed. We know, of course, we put them in the report, these companies. But the market valuation right now is sort of like near 80 billion, which is similar when Coinbase was listed. But of course, these are the 80 billion is only like the last rounds of valuation of these companies. So we think the number can be sort of like between like 100 to 150 billion. Of course, not every one of them will be launched or will be IPO'd this year, but I think there will be like a push for these companies to be listed, some of them, and I think for that you need a higher Bitcoin price. So I think there's an incentive to keep the Bitcoin price high, if not even push it higher from here.
That's really interesting. Now, Markus, we got to start wrapping up, and I want to ask you, outside of Bitcoin, what assets are you watching? We mentioned a few already. We mentioned some of the assets that really have this payments narrative, like XRP and XLM. We talked about this digital asset reserve that could potentially include XRP and Sol. I think we heard in some recent reports. Are those the assets you're watching if you're looking outside of Bitcoin? And for folks who are investing actively, who are watching the markets, I mean, what would you tell them to watch?
Well, I think, of course, there's, Solana, of course, and the Solana network, everything around it. There's, Sui and the network around it. I mean, there's some really interesting, stories, really. But I think I would stick to those larger caps. I think what we have learned from last year is actually that institutions are here, institutions are deploying capital, and they're looking for the large caps. So I think picking the small caps, there are many of them. And of course, we can make a story for many coins, but I think it's a simple narrative. If you just stick with the large ones, I think you're probably going to do quite well. And I think when you look how Bitcoin, the Bitcoin dominance is still 57%, it just tells you, risk adjusted, the Bitcoin is probably still the number one trade where you have the conviction, where the money is still coming in. And that's why we're seeing these strong ETF flows that are pushing it higher.
Markus, it's always a pleasure having you on Markets Daily. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for watching and listening. If you don't already, subscribe to the CoinDesk Podcast Network. That is available on all podcast platforms. If you prefer watching us, we're on YouTube. Hit subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and we will see you tomorrow.